Hey, deep divers, welcome back. So today we're diving deep, really deep into this whole concept of transracialism. I know a lot of you out there are super curious about it, and honestly, so are we,
Yeah, it's definitely one of those topics that just sparks so much debate.
for sure. And we've been doing a ton of research, digging through articles, scrolling through those heated social media threads, the one,
Oh, yeah, definitely.
even found some personal stories that are just, wow, really powerful.
It's a lot to unpack, that's for sure.
Absolutely. But that's what we're here for, right?
Yeah,
We want to get to the heart of this transracialism thing. Like, what's the core argument here?
exactly. Like, can someone genuinely identify as a race different from, the one they were assigned at birth?
Right. Because we're seeing this big criticism that transracial folks might not really get what it means to be that race, especially in terms of racism and oppression.
Huge point. It's one thing to love a culture, right? But some people are saying it's a whole other level to actually be part of a race that's faced, like, generations of systemic oppression.
It's a heavy topic for sure. And this is where it gets really interesting. A lot of people are comparing transracialism to transgenderism.
Oh, yeah, that comparison comes up all the time.
In one video we watched, this guy Simon Cushing, he put it pretty bluntly. He was like, if you're saying being transgender is okay, but transracial isn't, you got to show a clear difference between race and sex.
He's not pulling any punches there.
No, he's not.
Mm.
And one argument we keep seeing pop up is this idea that racial oppression is intergenerational.
Meaning, like, it gets passed down, right? Impacts identity in a way that maybe choosing a gender just doesn't.
Exactly. And this is where things like those Canadian residential schools come in.
Oh, right. The DeBuffon-Platon paper, right? They use that example, the whole cultural genocide thing, to make their point.
Yeah, and how that experience, that trauma, it's still shaping the identity of Indigenous communities even today, like generations later.
They're saying that kind of intergenerational trauma, it's specific to racial oppression. It's different from, just choosing a gender identity.
So I guess the question is, does experiencing that kind of generational oppression make racial identity like more fixed, more real even?
It's a tough one, right? But then you flip it around and it's like, what about trans women who haven't experienced female oppression?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Professor Dave, he made that point in one of his videos. He said some trans women might not fully get what it means to be a woman because they haven't lived through those specific challenges.
He used the example of trans women in sports. Like maybe they have an advantage because they went through male puberty.
It's almost like both sides are wrestling with the same thing, right?
Totally. Like,
Yeah.
how much does lived experience actually matter when we're talking about claiming an identity? What do you think, listeners? Weigh in. Let us know.
It's not a simple answer, that's for sure. But let's focus on the lived experience of racism and oppression specifically.
Okay, I like it. Getting specific.
So, do you have to experience it yourself to really understand what it means to belong to a certain race?
That's a good question. Like, is it a requirement? Thinking about that trans-Japanese woman's thesis.
Oh, right. The one where she talks about Rachel Dolezal.
Yeah. She lost her NAACP position, her teaching job, everything because she was presenting as black.
It's like the classic example people use to argue against transracialism.
Exactly. But then there's that other case, the guy who lived as a black man for like 10 months.
John Solomon, yeah, for that documentary.
And even Oprah was like, yeah, his experience during that time was real.
So, does immersing yourself in a culture like facing prejudice firsthand, does that make it more valid?
It's such a blurry line, right?
Mhm.
Like, where do we even draw that line? And the trans Japanese woman, she talked about how it's so much more than just surface stuff.
More than just liking the food and the music.
Exactly. She talked about language, slang, all those tiny social cues,
Yeah.
That stuff comes from being immersed in a culture from when you're a kid. It's
Yes.
hard to just pick it up later in life.
Absolutely. And don't forget the emotional side of it, all the feelings that come with it.
Right. We were reading through this forum, RCTA Safe, where transracial people talk about their experiences.
Oh, yeah, that one's super interesting.
And one person said something like, being a race is way more than just liking the language or feeling connected to one tiny part of a culture.
They're talking about something deeper, something that goes beyond just, appreciating it from afar.
Like you need to have lived it, the joys, the struggles, all of it.
To really claim it as your own.
And that brings us to this huge question right at the heart of this whole debate.
Hit us with it.
Is race just something we made up? A social construct?
Or is there some actual biological reality to it?
It's a huge debate. And I think it really gets to the core of what we're talking about today.
For sure. Like, if there's no biological basis for race, then doesn't that make lived experience and self-identification even more important?
Yeah, that's something to think about, right? And we're going to delve into that a lot more later in this deep dive, looking at both sides of the argument.
We're going to break it all down. Let's actually shift gears a bit and look at this whole debate through the lens of personal experiences.
Okay, yeah, I like that.
Remember that online forum we talked about, the black to white transracials?
Yeah, the one with all the stories from people transitioning to a white racial identity?
It gets pretty intense, right?
Oh, sure.
And what really struck me is how many of these posts talk about real-world consequences because of their race. Like they're talking about isolation, discrimination, even fear for their safety.
Oh, wow.
It's heavy stuff. Like one user talked about feeling constantly afraid and not having any friends because of his race.
Keys.
And another one shared this awful story about being humiliated by a bus driver. It made him feel like he put it, a ghetto delinquent.
Man, it's heartbreaking.
It is. It really puts a face on the whole issue of racism.
Yeah.
For these people, it's not just some abstract concept. It's their everyday life.
It's the reality.
And it makes you think, how can you tell someone to just be proud of their heritage when they're dealing with that kind of pain and prejudice?
It's so easy to just, dismiss their feelings, say they're looking for attention or whatever. But when you read their words, you can feel the rawness, the struggle they're going through. It's real.
And it challenges us to look beyond those simple explanations. We have to really grapple with the complexities of their experiences.
They all circle back to that core question.
Right.
Can you choose your race based on your lived experience of racism?
If someone feels like they don't belong to their assigned race because of how they've been treated, does that make their claim to a different identity valid?
It's a huge question, and it definitely sparks some heated debates. We're seeing that play out online in places like the biracial community of Reddit.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It's a space for people who identify as transracial to, connect and share their stories and talk about the challenges they face.
It's kind of like their own little world.
And what's so interesting is the diversity within that community. Like, you have people who feel super connected to a certain culture from a young age. They're drawn to the art, the language, the whole way of life,
Right.
even if they have no ancestral ties to it.
Right, it's like a deep, almost spiritual connection.
And then you have others whose desire to transition races is tied to really negative experiences, like bullying or being ostracized. For them, it's about escaping the trauma associated with their assigned race.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to find a place where they can just be themselves without all that baggage.
It's important to note that there's no single definition of what it means to be transracial within this community. Some people focus on internal identification, changing their appearance to match that. Others emphasize cultural immersion, learning to live authentically as a member of their chosen race.
It's a spectrum, really.
And then there's this whole tension between people who see transracialism as a mental health issue and those who view it as a valid expression of identity. Like, remember that post, Why You Should Avoid the Mental Health Industry?
Oh, yeah, that one was interesting.
There's definitely a distrust of traditional psychological approaches to transracialism within this community.
They feel like they're being pathologized.
Exactly. And they're also grappling with some heavy ethical questions, like the whole discussion around skin lightening products, like monobenzone.
Yeah, but that's a tough one.
It brings up concerns about safety, medicalization, reinforcing harmful beauty standards.
It's a lot to consider.
It's really fascinating, though, to see how this online community is trying to define itself, create its own norms, and navigate all these ethical and social landmines.
They're pioneers in a way.
Totally. They're coming up with their own language, sharing resources, supporting each other through something that a lot of people just don't understand.
It's a reminder that even within a topic as controversial as this, there are real people with genuine emotions and experiences.
And their stories deserve to be heard,
Absolutely.
even if we don't agree with their choices. Yeah. And speaking of choices, that transracial identity Wikipedia entry, it defines transracial as a label used by people who identify as a different race than the one they were assigned at birth. And it mentions how they might adjust their appearance, participate in activities associated with that race.
It's trying to capture the whole picture.
But that term, transracial, It's pretty loaded, right?
Yeah.
Historically, it was used to describe transracial adoption.
Where a child of one race is adopted by parents of a different race.
Exactly. So using it in this new context to talk about identity, it sparked a lot of controversy.
Like the word itself is evolving.
It's a good example of how language changes over time and how the way we define identity is constantly evolving too.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity to this whole discussion.
And that evolution of language and understanding, it brings up a whole new set of questions about how society will adapt to these evolving concepts of identity. Like, how is this going to play out in the real world?
Yeah, that's a big question.
One thing that comes to mind is how this might impact the experiences and narratives of groups that have faced historical oppression. Like, think about Black History Month.
Okay, yeah.
We were watching this YouTube channel, Transracial RCTA page, and they talk about how transracial identification could change the meaning and significance of traditions like Black History Month.
Interesting.
They argued that if people can move in and out of racial categories, it kind of blurs the lines of shared history and collective experiences of oppression that those traditions are built on.
I see what they're saying.
And it's not just about historical events and celebrations either.
Yeah.
It extends to real-world issues like reparations for past injustices.
Oh, wow.
If transracial identity becomes more widely accepted, how would that affect the conversation about who is entitled to reparations?
That's a really sensitive issue.
It is, and it highlights the need for these conversations to be nuanced and respectful. We're not trying to dismiss anyone's experiences or invalidate their feelings, but we do need to acknowledge the potential impact on those who have historically faced systemic oppression.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Exactly. And I think what we're seeing is that the conversation around transracialism is far from over. It's got these deep historical roots, and its implications go way beyond individual choices.
It's a huge societal issue.
It's about understanding identity, the impact of societal structures, and the relationship between race, culture, and lived experience.
And all of that is constantly evolving.
Right. And as we continue to grapple with these issues, we need to approach them with empathy, respect, and a willingness to engage in thoughtful dialogue.
Even when it's difficult or uncomfortable.
Especially when it's difficult or uncomfortable. All right, so for this last part of our deep dive, I think it's time to look at how these discussions about race and identity actually play out in the real world.
Yeah, like get out of the theoretical and see what's happening on the ground.
Exactly. We've been talking about theory, online communities, but what happens when these ideas hit everyday life?
Right, like how does this actually affect people's lives?
One case that really highlights these complexities is Martina Big.
Oh, the German model.
Yeah, she was featured on the, quote, Goats podcast, and she identifies as Black.
And she's undergone a lot of procedures to change her appearance.
A lot. Like, a lot. She's even said she's had injections that changed her race, which obviously...
Caused a huge stir.
Yeah, people were freaking out.
Yeah.
Her story really pushes the boundaries of what people consider acceptable when it comes to racial transformation.
She's definitely a controversial figure.
For sure. She talks about facing so much criticism, disbelief. People just don't get it. They see her actions as extreme, disrespectful, even harmful.
It's a really complex situation.
And her experience raises some fundamental questions, like, is it actually possible to change your race through physical modifications, even if you believe you identify as a different race internally?
That's a big one.
And how do we balance individual self-identification with, like, the cultural sensitivities surrounding race?
It's a tough balancing act.
It's like she's caught in this gray area. She talks about connecting with Black culture and feeling accepted by some members of the Black community.
Right.
But she also recognizes that her journey is, well, super controversial.
Not everyone understands or supports it.
Exactly. And I think her story is a perfect example of how messy and complicated this whole transracialism thing can be.
It forces us to confront our own assumptions about race.
Totally. And to consider the perspectives of those who are challenging those traditional racial categories, even if it makes us uncomfortable.
It often does.
And it's not just about these individual stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're also seeing the broader societal implications of transracialism starting to play out.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there are websites now, like Trace Info, specifically for people who identify as transracial.
It's interesting how the internet is creating these spaces for these communities to form and share information.
Just a whole new world online.
It is. It's a place where individuals can connect with others who get it, learn about different perspectives, find resources.
Stuff they might not be able to access offline.
Exactly. And as these online communities grow, we're probably going to see more and more discussions about transracialism happening in mainstream society, too.
That's already starting, right? Like in academia.
Yeah, there's that pilot study, Transracial Identity and the Effect on the Life Circumstances.
That one was really interesting. And then there are all those online spaces dedicated to these discussions, like the subreddits, transracialism, and
Ask Transrace.
yeah, that's the one. It's clear that transracialism is becoming more than just a fringe topic.
Society's having to grapple with it, whether they like it or not.
So, after all this deep diving, what does it all mean for you, dear listener? What have we learned?
Well, for one, you've got a much deeper understanding of this crazy complex issue. We've looked at the arguments, explored personal stories, the ethical concerns, the broader societal implications.
We've heard from a lot of different voices, too.
Academics, people who identify as transracial themselves.
We really tried to cover it all. As you continue to think about transracialism, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. How much does empathy matter in these conversations? Can you really understand someone else's experience without, like, literally walking in their shoes?
That's a good question.
And what are the limits of empathy when it bumps up against those deeply held beliefs about race and identity?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Right. It's something we all need to think about.
Mm.
And it's a question that's probably going to be debated for years to come. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep having these important conversations. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.